start recording. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's IBiM Seminar series. And today we are very delighted to have Professor Jaime Wong with us here today to give a very exciting talk about his work on aerial swimming and underwater flight. So as usual, I will give a very brief introduction of Dr. Wang. Dr. Wang is an assistant professor in mechanical engineering at University of Alberta, joining the faculty in 2018. Before this, he obtained his PhD at Queen's University in Kingston in 2017 on the subject of vorticity transport in leading-edge vortices. His research interests include unsteady airfoil flows, vortex dynamics, and optical flow metrology, especially as related to the biological swimming and flying. Outside of research, Dr. Wang enjoys work in public education and youth outreach in STEAM, aerodynamics, and aviation heritage, both through university initiatives and as a director of the Alberta Aviation Museum. So I will give the floor to Dr. Wang. Let's welcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. My name is Jaime. The title of my talk is a bit of a joke, which I will, like all good jokes, I'm going to have to explain it, but that will be in a slide from now. I'll give my acknowledgements at the front rather than the end. I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of my collaborators within the biological sciences, because without them, I wouldn't have good, exciting questions to ask. To look into. They're full of, you know, nice, clear problems to tackle in aerodynamics. And of course, most of this work was done by a couple students of mine, I think one of which is in the audience, who, you know, did all the actual labor on this. So what's in a title? So I guess I'm not entirely certain everyone's background. I'm sure some people are engineers, some people might be more from the biological sciences and elsewise. As many of you guys know, there's essentially two types of swimming. Well, there's many more, but we're going to focus on two right now. One would be drag-based propulsion. This is our example of a mouse. There should be a citation here. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to show up. I was going to point out that this was by Dr. Fish, which is a nice little example of nominative determinism. Apparently, if you're named Fish, you just work on swimming. But this would be like a dog paddling in the water, or maybe the first time a kid learns to swim. Basically, you have a offset of drag. You push one way, you reduce your drag, you go the other way, and eventually you get a net thrust. And you can compare that to lift-based propulsion, where, you know, as you have a airfoil, if that airfoil is moving up and down, that gives us an equivalent velocity, which directs a portion of our lift into the streamwise direction, right? Oh, there we showed up, fish. Now, many biologists tend to call this underwater flight for whatever reason. Obviously, it's fairly distinct from flight. It's, you know, no mass has to be suspended in the air, thanks to buoyancy. And so there's a lot of differences, but many biologists prefer the term underwater flight. And in particular, paleontologists, when they're looking at what they call secondarily aquatic marine reptiles like plesiosaurs, which I'm going to be looking at later in this talk. Another example of essentially the same phenomenon might be something like this. This is a beetle. Hopefully the video is playing without too much interruption, but this is a beetle flying on what's called a flight mill. And a flight mill is just a device to constrain the motion of this beetle so we can measure its flight behavior. And likewise, it's suspended in the air. It's on, let me turn on the laser pointer. It's suspended by a wire up here to constrain its flight path. And so it's not required to hold its own weight up either, right? And I've heard this called aerial swimming as well, because its weight is supported rather by buoyancy than this wire. But I thought, curiously, these are almost identical situations. So it's interesting that I landed on projects that deal with the same thing twice. But I just wanted to compare looking at these prehistoric marine reptiles, these plesiosaurs, and looking at the flight of these pine beetles. I just wanted to compare and contrast some of the dimensional analysis that we've done looking at these two very distinct situations, but with a lot of similarities. So I wanted to talk about the mountain pine beetle first, and a little bit of background in ecology for those of you who aren't familiar. This is a mountain pine beetle. From nose to tail, they're about 5 millimeters long, quite small animals. And historically, they've sort of lived in this red region, but due to a number of factors, including climate change, they've started expanding, moving westward. This is roughly where my laser pointer is right now. That's roughly where I live in Edmonton. And these pine beetles are just crossing the Rocky Mountains. So this border right there represents the peak of the Rocky Mountains, which is a fairly difficult obstacle. And they're just crossing that into Alberta. Meanwhile, further south in the United States, they're likewise possibly going to make it to another species of pines by the Great Lakes. Now, these beetles attack the bark of a tree. They're bark beetles, and they disperse by flight. So you attack a tree, you feed, you lay some eggs, but the tree is no longer useful as a resource after this occurs. So the young insects need to fly away to a new tree, attack a new tree, and continue the process. Now, this process is very destructive. Many of you might have seen pictures like this. This red swath of trees are trees that are either dying or dead, that have been attacked by pine beetles, destroying the trees. And as you can see here, it's a big chunk of this particular region of forest. This has been accelerated by climate change, as I said, because often the climate, the weather during the winter has limited their spread. Basically, they'll die in the winter. But with milder winters, you have a greater rates of survival, and they attack more trees. They attack more trees decay, die, release their carbon dioxide, increase the risk of forest fire. You have more CO2 in the atmosphere. Planet gets warmer, and you get more pine beetles. These are among the many what you call tripping points in climate change, because the hotter the temperature, the more pine beetles attack. The more pine beetles attack, the more carbon in the atmosphere. And a shocking fact that I only recently learned is that Canada's boreal forests are currently net CO2 emitters. So you think these big green swaths of trees as carbon sinks, but currently they are shrinking by both natural death and by forest fire. So because they have to disperse by flight, we study the flight of these pine beetles on a device called a flight mill. This is a pine beetle actually tied to our flight apparatus. For a sense of scale, that's a standard electrical outlet. And this is a thin steel rod, a very low friction bearing, and this beetle can just tow this whole apparatus in a circle. This is just some lines drawn on a piece of paper. These beetles use their vision as their primary feedback mechanism for flight. And so having a little bit of contrast in the environment actually helps to get them flying. Now, the construction of these flight mills is very simple. This steel rod, which is used to suspend the beetle, is punched through a Teflon cylinder, which is on a little needle. Now, this Teflon cylinder isn't suspended by its own weight, or it's not resting on its own weight. There is a magnet right here, and there's another magnet right there. And so its mass is, for the most part, supported by the magnets. And you just have the Teflon in a needle bearing. This is a little Hall effect sensor to measure the rotation, but you only get one pulse per cycle. And so the limitations of this apparatus is, so far, there's very little characterization of the drag, the friction in the literature. And so it's very hard to tell the energy consumption. Indeed, the primary way that biologists measure the energy consumption in these flight mill studies is they have to run them for a very long time, 24 hours or more, 48 hours, something like that. And they weigh the beetle before and after with the assumption that all the energy required for flight came out of fats. And they'll actually dissolve the fats out of the insect to measure the lipid content after the flight. And they'll say, okay, the mass difference is probably all, consumed fats, which produces a number, but perhaps not the most accurate number. Second, the relationship to free flight is unknown. So the insect has its weight supported. And so some people think that these devices overestimate flight endurance, but they also have to tow this flight mill around. They're overcoming the extra drag of this flight mill. So some think it is the opposite. Some think it underestimates flight endurance. And then there's the differences in flight kinematics. Obviously, if you're pinned to a flight mill, you're not going to fly the same as in free flight. And so we're limited by long duration tests. And we're limited by resolution. We don't really know at the small scales what these insects are doing. And so it's hard to measure efficiency, for example. Excuse me. So modeling friction isn't that hard for engineers. So I thought this was the low-hanging fruit to start off with. If we just assume a linear model and cross our fingers, we could guess an exponential decay. If we give this rod a flick and just let it decay under friction, we could guess a sort of linear decay model, under which case our friction coefficient would just be whatever this exponent turns out to be, multiplied by whatever this moment of inertia turns out to be. You can get your students to do lots of measurements and figure out the moment of inertia, and then also do a couple experiments on the flight mill, seeing how quickly it decays, like so. Oh, I didn't know that was going to flicker. I'm going to stop that. I apologize to anybody who's, sensitive to flashing lights or anything like that. I didn't know it was going to flicker. But essentially, the video's showing the rod being flicked and just decaying under friction. And the result, thankfully, because otherwise we would have been spending quite a lot of time trying to figure this out, is perfect exponential decay. It looks like a fairly linear bit of friction. This curve fit, the black dashed line, captures, 99.9% of the variation in the underlying measurements. And the deviation really happens right at the very lowest speeds, where presumably things like static friction might start to be significant. Actually, that's not the right exponent. I think there should be like a 10 to the -6 or something there, but we get a number out of this thing. So given that we know how much force this insect is generating, if we, with a camera, we're measuring its velocity, we have a characterization of the friction of the model. We basically know how much thrust this insect is producing. We can start trying to compare that to the kinematics of its wings. So this is just a 1 centimeter spaced out grid, very cheaply made. This was a low-cost project. This was just made on an inkjet printer, but we did verify that its scale was accurate. But given a calibrated image, we can start measuring the kinematics of this insect's wing. So for example, we have some X component of the wingtip and some Y component of the wingtip, where we're just tracking where this wing is within our frame and assuming that the in-plane motion of the insect along its circular trajectory is relatively small. Now, here from this data, we can basically put a straight line through this x component and say that's probably pretty close to its velocity. We can run a Fourier transform, get a frequency out of that. And very quickly, we have quite a few dimensionless numbers, Reynolds number, Strehl number, reduced frequency, that sort of thing. And if we subtract the velocity, we can start looking at the stroke angle. This is, I think, about 10 cycles of motion of the wing centered around the body. And the loop is clockwise around the top. It's not quite the most extreme figure eight that we've ever seen. But for example, one of the things we want to do in the future, this is very preliminary at these stages, we want to start comparing the stroke angle here versus if we can potentially measure the free flight behavior of this insect, the stroke angle in free flight, and then start saying, what angle do these insects really want to be in? One thing we noticed right away is the Strehl numbers are enormous. So as many of you might be familiar, there's broad evolutionary convergence on cruising conditions of a Strehl number of about 0.3 when measured by Strehl number about 0.3. And we were getting Strehl numbers on the order of like 3 or 4. So it seems like these insects are trying to put a huge amount of energy into the flow. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on insect behavior, or that even, something like psychology could be applied to something with so few neurons. But, it really seems like they're trying to escape, get off of this thing, or at the very least that towing the apparatus is a very taxing process that requires a lot of energy. So just a little bit about the kinematics here. If we have a forward motion at a flapping amplitude, or approximate flapping amplitude, of course, we have, a frequency, a period, an amplitude. We want to start turning this into a force, right? And we would expect, if it's generating some sort of leading edge vortex or something like that, we would expect that the circulation should scale with u squared in some sort of way. This is shown up in all sorts of contexts. Morton showed this was the circulation generation of flat plate boundary layer. Didden showed that this was the circulation generation of a piston cylinder generated vortex ring. And you could show that this also holds to some degree for leading edge vortex formation. So given some oscillatory pattern of flight, what do we expect that u squared to be? Well, if we have a sinusoidal motion, I know this is perhaps not the best approximation, but if we have a sinusoidal motion, we would expect the velocity is going to scale with 2f h naught. And so the total velocity magnitude would be 2 pi f h naught, which squared, which many of you might start seeing looks quite a lot like a Strehl number. So if we take the velocity magnitude squared and divide through by u infinity, we actually get something that looks like a Strehl number squared showing up in here. So we would expect, if we want to compare the kinematics of the wing to the forces generated by the wing, probably we want some Strehl number squared type scaling to show up here. The unfortunate thing is, by our calibration of our device, we only get the net thrust. We'd really like to break this down into coefficient of thrust and drag, but we only just get a net thrust. And so we need some model for CD in order to make this work. So luckily, this has been done in the past. I wasn't expecting Professor Smits to be in the audience. I think I saw his name show up. But this sort of scaling has been done before. So this is an example of a thrust coefficient versus a Strehl number for a pitching airfoil. at various Reynolds numbers in this particular example, where we have a brilliantly straight line based on a couple optimized parameters here. And we thought this was a great opportunity to see how we can apply this model. Now, we don't expect it to be as straight of a line because, first of all, we're looking at an experiment rather than CFD. We're looking at multiple individuals rather than a identical airfoil every time. 3D flow rather than 2D flow, primarily heaving rather than pitching flow. But surprisingly, we actually get more or less a straight line. And I think R squared is something like 0.8 for this, where we more or less copied their fitting parameters, although with a couple modifications. We changed the Reynolds number scaling based mostly on the fact that we were in the tens of Reynolds number rather than thousands. We thought a linear Reynolds number relationship would probably make more sense. And we just let these coefficients fall out from the fitting without, at this point, because it's a preliminary work, without giving too much thought about the interpretation of these numbers. Now, one little number that stands out as a little bit weird is the negative sign here in CD. And I'm not really sure how to interpret that yet, although I suspect that for this insect, we're not going to cross, if we look at a 0,0 point here, when our insect starts flapping its wings, we're not going to actually have any motion of our flight mill at the small scales of Struhl number, because it has to overcome the static friction. There's going to be some minimum Struhl number before we can actually start measuring its net thrust. And that probably puts a minimum on both our thrust and our Struhl number before we can start collecting any data, right? So we'll have some minimum bounds that we can't go under here. That's my suspicion at this point, although I haven't been too far along in testing that. Now, depending on how mathematical you are, a correlation of 0.8 might not sound great to you, but within the world of experimental entomology, 0.8 is amazing. So I want to compare this to a previous study on pine beetles. This is, a study on the aerodynamics of pine beetles, of their flight, based on a flight mill. And this kind of demonstrates, if nothing else to me, how brave biologists are that they can look at this data and confidently draw a straight line through it. But this is statistically meaningful data. There's a correlation. Beetles that weigh more fly for longer. And I haven't labeled this, but one of these plots, I believe it's on the left, is for female beetles, male beetles on the right. There's actually statistically significant differences in the flight by gender, or actually not by gender, by sex. I don't think gender applies to insects, but we're actually able to see somewhat more extreme that exact thing, potentially. Of course, we have a very small N at this point. We have maybe on the order of 10, 15 individuals. We really want to up that to something like 50. So this is incomplete data currently being filled out. But we're actually seeing much more extreme both thrust generation and Struhl number in male beetles than in female beetles. So that is also interesting. So I thought this was an interesting comparison to some previous work that we've done on Plesiosaur swimming, which fell into my lap through a completely different means, but ultimately has some similarities and was addressed in a sort of similar way. So we were looking at plesiosaurs. Those of you who aren't familiar, these are extinct marine reptiles. They're called secondarily aquatic, meaning they evolved from land reptiles who in turn evolved from aquatic reptiles. So this is the second time this family tree has gone through water. And typically they're broken into two broad categories, plesiosaurs and plesiosaurs. One has a long neck, one has a short neck. And because these show up all the time in Alberta, because we used to be underwater 100 million years ago, a local museum came and asked, well, can we talk about their swimming behavior just from the fossil evidence? So there's a couple interesting things about plesiosaurs, mainly this four flipper thing. If you look at other lift-based propulsion, often you have some lift-based propulsion on one pair of appendages and not so much the latter. Maybe marine mammals are slightly different. You might have lift-based propulsion on two different surfaces, but they have quite different kinematics. They have quite different behavior, right? So the tail flippers on the sea lion and the forward flippers are fairly different in geometry, whereas these are quite similar. And if you compare it to like a four-winged insect, typically the insect wings are very, very close, highly coupled, whereas here we have much greater spacing, right? Historically, we've been approximating these as airfoils, and we have followed in that form. Presumably, if they are using lift-based propulsion, they had some sort of airfoil shape, and so we abstracted it in the same sort of way. So the base parameters that we were studying were things like the chord. If we care about aerodynamics, we'd care about the forward velocity, the amplitude of motion, the frequency of motion, but which we could collect into a Stroll number or a reduced frequency. But the limitation here is that if we wanted to know about the thrust behavior, these things like the frequency and forward velocity are obviously lost in an extinct animal. We only have fossil remains. We have, maybe we can get amplitude, maybe we can get chord, something like that, but we don't know how fast they swam. And so how can we sort of reconstruct this data? How can we use some existing knowledge to our advantage? Well, one thing that caught our eye, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is the evolutionary convergence in Stroll number. So for example, we have three fairly different species on this plot, and yet they all have fairly similar flapping or pitching amplitudes. And we're wondering if we can apply that to our tandem foil problem and get some sort of meaningful results out of it. So the tandem foil problem shows up all the time in, say, formation flight, or in the interface or reaction, the interrelation between various fins on an animal. But in our case, we're looking specifically at airfoil-like motion, which is primarily characterized by the interfoil spacing. Basically, how far is that foil from that foil, and the phase difference. Are they flapping like this? Are they flapping like this? And those two differences, the phase difference and the interfoil spacing, more or less determine efficiency and thrust coefficient. They're highly coupled. These straight lines are basically indicating lines of constant vortex arrival. So a vortex shed by the front foil intercepts the hind foil at a more or less constant rate along these lines, which determines their efficiency. But to a significant degree, we've ignored one major piece of geometry here, which is, to what extent is the forward flipper developed versus the hind flipper? And this varies between plesiosaurs and plesiosaurs. You might just see this bone is extremely thick. We would expect that to support a huge amount of forces. This one it's not small, but it's not nearly the same size, right? And so can we infer anything from this fossil development if we have uneven development between the shoulder and the pelvis? So one idea we had was to maybe start looking at, there's evolutionary convergence on strule number. Can we do something similar with reduced frequency? We don't know the velocity. We don't know the frequency. But perhaps we can get things like the flapping angle from a joint information. So for example, on your shoulder, there's a ball and socket joint. The shape of this joint might be able to give us a range extension, a range of motion. And maybe we can start extracting some of the geometric parts of reduced frequency and strule number and use our evolutionary convergence to our advantage. So if we have reduced frequency and strule number, obviously both of those have a frequency and a velocity in them. That's the thing, those are the things that we don't know. And so if strule number converges to 0.3, presumably we get some scaling based on the amplitude of flapping and the geometry of the wing, the aspect ratio in this case, that relates the two of them. Now, this is of course very, very limited. Strule number converges for cruising conditions, not escape maneuvers or that sort of thing, where we would expect agility to really matter. And so this isn't really a mechanism that we'd recommend for a living animal. Really, this is because we have so little information about extinct marine reptiles that we have no good way to actually do a better estimate for agility. And so this is really our method of last resort, let's say. But it turns out if we use this geometric relationship, this strule number, give it a constant 0.35, and compare our physical characteristics of our motion, we can, to a reasonable degree, predict the reduced frequency of many animals. So this is the reduced frequency predicted with the geometric characteristics of an animal versus the actual measured reduced frequency of that animal in flight. And there's a little bit of spread in here, very little spread from the world of paleontology, but perhaps quite a bit from the world of aerodynamics. We have some ability to predict reduced frequency. Now, what we want to do is see, can we predict that using, let's say, fossil data? So we attempted to use the skeletal information from a living animal so we could actually measure its real reduced frequency. And we used the angle on the joints to estimate their flapping amplitudes. And this tended to work quite well. I'm going quite quickly because I think I'm over time versus what I planned. But we do end up seeing significant differences among plesiosaurs. Mostly this is split by the aspect ratio of their flippers. So in this case, we broke these into high, moderate, and low aspect ratio plesiosaurs. And historically in the literature, quite a few plesiosaurs have been compared to sea turtles, which, based on this scaling, that's probably a good approximation for our high aspect ratio plesiosaurs when we're trying to make an analogy to a living animal. But perhaps that's not great when we start looking at very low aspect ratio plesiosaurs, which we expect to have a higher degree of agility, right? These seem to be more associated with faster, more agile swimmers like penguins and that sort of thing. And this happens to correspond with let's say, equivalent theories about plesiosaur agility based on, in particular, the neck. So it was expected that the longer the plesiosaur's neck, the less agile they would be because it could support a lower force, and also by their evolutionary lineage, where these long neck plesiosaurs are all clustered together. Now, in the process of working on this, Excuse me. I put my slides in the wrong order. In the process of looking at this, one thing that we noticed is that the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle, that is the shoulder joint and the hip joint, had very different levels of development in at least a few species of plesiosaur. That's different levels of muscle attachment and different excursion angles that were possible. And one thing that was somewhat missing in the literature was, does this amplitude ratio really affect our thrust and lift behavior? So we decided to look into that. We ended up using PIV experiments on tandem foils. These were pitching airfoils, and we characterized them based on an amplitude ratio. Jeff will be happy to know that this was actually published in Physics of Fluids recently. But we looked at
Thank you for that.
Yeah, we looked at 3 amplitude ratios. Basically, we said we had rear bias propulsion, where we have a higher amplitude at the rear foil. This was kind of replicating a plesiosaur. We had even amplitude on the front and hind foil, and then we had forward biased propulsion, higher amplitude in the front foil, which was more similar to, say, plesiosaurs, just based on the structure of their skeleton. We tried a whole bunch of different phase angles for all of these airfoils, keeping Reynolds number, frequency, and interfoil spacing constant. Now, for the hind foil, which we kept at a constant amplitude, this meant we were at a constant Stroll number, constant reduced frequency. But for the front airfoil, which the amplitude was varying, we ended up with a slightly varying Stroll number at the forward airfoil. Sorry, I think.
There you go. Start
Okay.
it again.
So I'll continue.
There you go. Yeah.
So we were looking at different amplitude ratios, and we noticed that the rear biased cases generated by a significant margin the highest thrust. That would be the plesiosaur case, where the plesiosaur case, the forward bias propulsion generated very little thrust. In fact, for the vast majority of phase differences between the forward and hind foils, they generated no thrust to drag. And for those of you who don't know, there's a bit of a holy war inside plesiosaur locomotion in that world, where there's a question: did these animals use 2 fins or 4 fins, 2-wheel drive or 4-wheel drive? And this kind of, the idea that we produce almost no thrust in one case kind of points towards probably 2 fins in some cases, probably 4 fins in other cases. It's worth noting here that the even amplitude case has very, very similar thrust over most phases to the forward biased case. And so it seems like I wouldn't put too much weight into the differences between, say, these 2 cases, for example. So it looks like those might have been equally valid options for producing thrust, but greater amplitude, presumably greater energy, we would expect the more efficient of these would be the rear biased case. So obviously the rear bias configuration produces almost the most thrust, despite the fact that the forward foil is not generating very, very strong vortices. If we compare the wake, we have a fairly similar time averaged jet in the wake, despite a much larger vortex coming into the forward foil here. And if we compare that to the forward bias case, we have almost no thrust being produced in this wake. And a large reason for that, I'm going to cycle this over again, is that the vortex from the forward foil is just, it's never timed correctly. We have, let's say, this red vortex trying to interact with this blue vortex, and we get destruction of that vorticity, a reduction in circulation. And so the vortex in the wake always ends up being much, much, much weaker. And so that kind of indicates to us that the coupling between forward and hindfoil, even though the spacing's pretty big, three chord lengths apart, actually remains very close, much more close than had previously been thought in the plesiosaur literature. So those are the two examples that I wanted to share about just some dimensional analysis on these underwater flight and aerial swimming. And that's all I have. I think my next slide's blank. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have at this point.
Okay,
I have a question.
Jasmine have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you slide us back to slide 11? And this may be a naive question, but
yeah.
Whoa, that's not the one I was expecting. More than
which one were you
11.
expecting?
The one with the Reynolds number to the -1/2.
Yeah, that just got covered up by a plot. Sorry.
Okay, there we go. So so you explained that the coefficients were fitted to data, but why not fit the exponent to the Reynolds number too? And then by two, I mean also.
Sorry, are you saying leave this exponent as a floating parameter?
Well, at least to arrive at the conclusion that -1 was the correct value, you might have fitted that too, right?
We did so. I think, how long did I go? I think I was already at something like 50 minutes. So I didn't want to explain every single point, but we did look not necessarily at fitting a continuous range of values, but we tried at least 0.5 and 1, and 1 was the much better fit.
Got it. Very nice presentation. That was a real treat. Thank you for that.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Thank you for your presentation. It's a very interesting talk. I want to ask you a question. Maybe around the last page, and the phase difference of
say something like this.
Yes, this difference. Have you considered the space between these two foils or foils?
We did not. So we used essentially the spacing that showed up in the fossil record, which is about 3. There is some variation in that number from species to species, but ballpark the spacing of 3 was about typical. So that's what we used. However, in the past, this is another physics of fluids paper, but Muscat et al. Looked at foil spacing, among other things, and showed that the phase and foil spacing, at least for a equal amplitude flapping motion, they were essentially coupled. So essentially, if you change your inner foil distance, then you can adjust the phase such that the vortex shed by the leading foil hits the hind foil at the same time. You end up with broadly the same results. So it doesn't seem to be the most critical parameter. Either you can vary phase or inner foil spacing, and ultimately they end up with broadly equivalent results.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Jeff.
So Jamie, you started by saying that your title was a joke that you would come back to. I'm not sure you came back to the joke, but
I thought I did.
Sometimes
basically they're one thing. They're not two different things.
Let me interrupt you there, but let me just suggest something that title is eminently publishable. It's not just funny, but it would attract readership, and so I wouldn't I wouldn't use that just for presentations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay,
anyways, great. It's one of the best titles I've ever seen, you know, and so
well, thanks.
there you go. Yeah. I have one other thing. It's not really a question, Jamie, but you've done so much cool video here that I'm motivated to tell the younger members of the audience that when you publish, you should publish your video in integral multimedia, and you should publish your video because statistically, I've learned that reviewers prefer articles about video that actually incorporate video. Secondly, there's a big difference between integral multimedia, which is archived, and so your great-grandchildren are sure to be able to watch it, and supplementary material, which is not archival. Okay, not a question, just a comment. Well done.
My brother works in the motion picture industry, and of course their saying is "show don't tell," right? If you can, if you can say it in a video rather than in text, people will understand it quite a bit better.
Well, yes, I'm speaking as an editor here because if you understand editorship as your job is to incline papers towards acceptance, then that it's in that spirit that I'm offering these suggestions. Yeah. And then, of course, towards attracting attention once it's published, and articles that incorporate video attract a huge amount of attention compared to those that don't. It's a new age. Yeah. Anyways, nicely done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime. And actually, we still got like 7 minutes. If anyone have any further questions.
Yes. Yeah, may I ask 2 questions, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, Jaime Wong, very interesting talk. I'm also from Beijing. Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first one, can you elaborate a little bit more on your instruction of the trajectory of the wing of the beetle? So you printed you presented a curve. But I think I'm asking because the wing, I think, is 3-dimensional and it's flexible, it's changing shape. So how do you define the trajectory of the wing?
So these trajectories, I'm assuming this is what you're talking about, these plots here.
Yes.
These trajectories were defined by the wingtip to the best of our ability in measuring the wingtip. So we haven't been looking at twist or angle of attack, geometric angle of attack quite yet. That's something we want to include as we go along. But like I said, this is somewhat preliminary work.
Okay, so it's the projection of the wingtip of the wing on your measurement plane.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. The second one about the tandem foils. So you are using the plunging airfoils, right? While the actual swimming or flight, it's not just heaving, but also with rotation. It's a flapping motion. How do you think the rotation would influence the final result?
So we did not have heaving. I apologize if that was unclear. We had pure pitching. I did look at literature that the only picture I posted was of somebody doing heaving. So I understand if that's confusing and I apologize. We were just looking at pure pitching. Obviously these are, obviously your question is still valid, the same problem. If we're just looking at pitching versus heaving versus a combined motion, we'll get presumably a different result. I mean, if I knew the answer, then we'd have much less job security, I suppose. I would expect things to be similar, but I can't say for certain until the experiment's done. And of course, the actual motion was neither of those things. We had a flapping motion, at a joint, and obviously the interaction with the tip vortex will come into this. But of course, the goal is to add complexity sort of piecewise as we go. And so all in due time is the hope that we can look at that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay, I understand. More to be done. Looking forward to see more of your results.
Oh, thank you. Oh, did I have the logo twice?
Oh, I have a quick question. So you have simplified to pitching airfoils. How much is the three-dimensional effect in this animal motion?
With the tandem foil, I think it would vary by species, genuinely, because some of these animals have very, very high aspect ratios, some have very low. And so I would expect the three-dimensionality for something like the Plesiosaurs would be quite a bit higher, right? And so that effect is probably species specific, but that would be interesting to look at.
All right, thank you. Thank you. So I've seen in some pages you have say something like the evolutionary convergence of the Stuart number. I'm just curious about that. Is there any explanation?
Essentially, that's the optimal efficiency. So this is a paper from Taylor et al., but there's also some lovely results from John DeBerry's group and Trantafalu at MIT. This is essentially the peak efficiency of an airfoil. And it comes down to how much mass you can shove into a vortex before you start getting secondary vortices form. So you make a vortex as big and strong as you can until it won't accept any more mass, and then you stop, and you end up with this through-hole number.
I see. So basically, in both flight and in swimming worlds, it's kind of a universal.
Yeah.
I see. Interesting. Thank you. So do we have any further questions? If not, shall we just stop here today? And thank you, Jaime, and thank you everyone for coming. I'll stop recording now.